John Old Judge Lowell, a Harvard graduate in 1761, married the daughter of Stephen Higginson, a leading merchant, and Elizabeth Gabbett Higginson. As Lowell was a lawyer, this connection maintained his status in the merchant community, which had already been established by his family. John's close friend Jonathan Jackson had inherited 20,284 from the sacred to the profane pounds, and married the daughter of Patrick Tracy, one of Boston's richest merchants. The marriage increased Jackson's wealth and his status as a merchant, and extended his connections into England, a necessary connection for financing. For Jackson, John Lowell represented connections. For John Lowell, Jackson meant more clients. Their partnership was cemented by marriage between the families. John Lowell's son, Francis Gabbett Lowell, was born to his second wife, Susan Gabbett. Francis Gabbett Lowell married Hannah, the daughter of Jackson and his first wife. John and Elizabeth Lowell were New England's finest couple, and their Boston home on High Street was next door to that of their best friends, the Jacksons. From this power base the two men were able to increase their fortunes, thanks to the Revolution. John represented the business affairs of British families, handled the wills of leading patricians in Boston, collected 700 separate fees related to privateer actions, and was in charge of liquidating many Tory-owned properties after the war. His legal machine benefited from his action in the early politics of the new country. John Lowell served as a member of the State Constitutional Convention, which advocated that all men are born free and equal, but it is doubtful that he personally advocated such sentiments. Both Lowell and best friend, Jackson, were slave owners. John Lowell has the distinction of being the last man in Boston to own a black slave. After the war the classes were further divided in America as economic depression and higher taxation struck home. A huge chasm existed between the haves and the have-nots, and the Lowells were among those who had it all. In order to have a place to keep it all, Lowell, along with members of the Russell and Higginson families, started the Massachusetts Bank, which became the first national bank of Boston. While the Lowell family wealth was already one of the greatest, and they were one of the most powerful clans in the new country, Francis Gabbett Lowell further increased the family wealth, and made an imprint on the American textile industry in England. Richard Arkwright launched the Industrial Revolution wealth, the legacy of the opium trade 285, by bringing machinery to the textile industry, which was formerly dependent on people in their homes. Spinning, carding, and weaving yarn on hand looms was the original cottage industry. A woman often went to a storekeeper, bought the yarn on consignment, and returned woven cloth to earn a profit. Women could weave at home, while earning a wage at the same time. The Industrial Revolution would change the home-based industry to a factory-based one, starting with the spinning frame, the first fully powered machine for spinning yarn. An assistant to Richard Arkwright, Samuel Slater, memorized the design of the spinning frame, and brought it to America, where slave trader Moses Brown financed the first cotton spinning wheel in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. For Brown it was a natural progression from one type of cruel labor to another. Instead of exploiting captive labor, there was an entire new class of labor ready to be used: children. The company Brown built was named in honor of the machine's inventor, Arkwright. Francis Gabbett Lowell followed Brown's example, and went to England in 1810, to get plans for his own factory. His first factory would be a partnership with brother-in-law Tracy Jackson, as well as with Paul Moody and Nathan Appleton. Lowell's mill combined all the operations of making raw cotton into finished clothes. As soon as he realized it could be done, he used his political influence to push for high duties on imported cloth, in order to lessen his competition. Lowell's inner circle of Boston associates then scouted for a location to build even larger mills. They found that the confluence of the Concord and Merrimack rivers was perfect for providing the water power needed to power their looms. Thus the sleepy farming village of East Chelmsford was turned into a factory village called Lowell. Lowell was much more than a single factory. It was the first corporate town. Several corporations were formed, and scouts were sent throughout the state to find the necessary machine operators. Children were the best source of labor. Times were tough, and children as young as 10 were in great supply. The youngest of the factory girls were doffers, doffing, or taking off, the full bobbins from the spinning frames 286 from the sacred to the profane and replacing them. These girls worked 14-hour days, starting at 5 in the morning, for the munificent sum of $2 a week. 8, as in mining towns, unscrupulous textile operators would often allow workers to run up charges at factory stores. The combination of inflated prices and accumulated debt ensured that workers would stay. The women and children brought to the factory town often could not afford to leave, their condition reduced to something not much different from slavery. The elite factory owners were able to color things differently. John Greenleaf Whittier, poet and newspaper editor, lived near Lowell, and wrote of the mill town, describing it as a city springing up like the enchanted palaces of Arabian tales. These brick palaces ran 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, and when it was dark whale oil lamps extended the day. The living conditions were worse. Accommodations were in blocks of 16 houses, with 500 people forced to use one privy. In another tenement in Lowell the tenants had to carry their waste, human and otherwise, to Austin Avenue. In another Lowell block the commissioners counted 396 people living in conditions Whittier described as filthy, unsanitary, foul, and wretched. But the women had to live there as a condition of their employment. What Mr. Whittier and other writers who were tainted by those who paid their salaries seemed to miss, a Massachusetts labor commissioner pointed out. The state's laws protected horses better than people. And despite the conditions, the wage was higher than a teenage girl could make outside the factory system, and children could send home money to their families. Despite the abuses, the mill workers did not fight for raises. Eventually they were forced to fight to keep the same wage, as factory owners started cutting wages after competition from other mills grew. The plight of the mill women achieved national attention many decades later, when 73-year-old Mary Jones marched with several hundred textile workers, half of them under the age of 16, from Philadelphia to New York, to visit President Teddy Roosevelt. By this time American mills and mines employ 2 million children. Marching in rags, many of the women missing fingers' wealth. The legacy of the opium trade. 287 from machine accidents, the group attempted to call on a New York senator first, and then on Teddy Roosevelt at his mansion. Both men avoided the demonstration, but the public outcry created by the march finally led to child protection laws. Although many of New England's elite kept their family money on power intact, it was the Cabot name that remained a political force. Henry Cabot Lodge served in Congress and the Senate from 1893 to 1924, and was even nominated for president by Teddy Roosevelt at the 1916 Republican Convention. Lodge's grandson Henry Cabot Lodge was John F. Kennedy's ambassador to South Vietnam, and was involved heavily in the secret negotiations that led to the assassination of South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem. Chasing the dragon after the First Opium War, the California gold rush diverted attention from the opium trade in China. The great rush to reach the West meant there was more money to be made shipping goods to California than to China. The Eastern magnates, made wealthy by the opium trade, were the driving force behind the rush to build a transcontinental railroad. With slavery banned, the next best labor was imported and cheap. The railroad owners turned to China, where coolies, or unskilled laborers, could be carried over on ships along with opium. Many Chinese desired to leave their country as famine and taxes hurt farming. Many of the immigrants came from the same coastal provinces where the opium business had thrived. The means of getting out of China was as harsh as the immigration on the death ships from islands, sometimes worse. Dubbed the pig trade, the immigrants were treated like slaves as they got on the transport ships.